"Send the eldest," the Duke of Bramhope said, and the words fell into the drawing-room of Marrowfield like a stone into still water. He did not raise his voice. He never did. But the woman across from him, narrow, jeweled, breathing quickly through a fixed and gracious smile, went the colour of tallow, and Corin Ashfield, 9th Duke of Bramhope, watched the smile crack at one corner and understood, in that instant, that he had been meant to take the other one. He had come to Marrowfield to settle a debt, and instead he had been offered a daughter. That was how these things went. A gaming loss too large to name in daylight, a note of hand pressed into his steward's ledger 3 winters ago by a man since dead, and now the widow, Lady Marrowfield. Born to nothing and married up to a title that had rotted beneath her, sitting before him with 2 girls arranged like merchandise, and one of them clearly, painfully, the one she meant to keep. The younger sat nearest the fire. Pretty in the ordinary way of well-fed girls, all pink and gold, her hands folded to show a ring, her eyes lifting to his and dropping again with a coyness that had plainly been rehearsed a great many times before the glass. Beatrix, the mother had called her, and had said the name the way one says the name of a favourite horse. "This is my Beatrix," as though the room might not have noticed which daughter mattered. The other stood by the window, half in shadow, and had not been introduced at all. Corin was 36 and had spent the last 4 years learning to read a room the way a physician reads a wound, quickly, coldly, before it could bleed on him. He had learned it out of necessity. Men lied to him because he was rich. Women smiled at him because he was rich and grim and unmarried. And there was a certain kind of ambition that mistook grimness for a locked door it might have the pleasure of opening. He had learned to distrust the smile before the words. So he did not look long at Beatrix, who had been polished for him. He looked at the girl by the window who had not. She was thin, which the fashion did not favour. Her gown was 3 seasons out of date and had been let down at the hem, the old crease showing pale where the cloth had faded around it. Her hair was dark and had been pinned by her own hands, he thought, without a maid, because one strand had escaped at the temple and no one had smoothed it. She was not looking at him with ambition. She was not looking at him at all. She was looking at the window latch, at the grey afternoon beyond it, with the particular stillness of a person who has taught herself not to be in a room she cannot leave. The eldest, Lady Marrowfield, repeated as if she had misheard, though he had spoken clearly. "Your Grace, I fear there has been. Rena is not, that is, Beatrix is the daughter of the house. Rena is my late husband's girl by his first wife. She has no portion, no connections. She keeps to herself. She would not suit. She is the eldest," Corin said, "and the debt was your husband's. It passes to his blood before it passes to yours." That was not strictly the law, and he knew it, and Lady Marrowfield, who did not know the law, only that men used it as a whip, did not dare say so. He had chosen his words to close the door. He watched them do it. He watched the calculation move behind her eyes, quick as a rat behind a wall. If she refused, he could call the note, and the note would ruin them. If she gave him the girl she had planned all afternoon to give, she lost her Beatrix to a man the whole county whispered was mad or scared or worse. But if she gave him the other, the stepdaughter, the unwanted one, the girl who cost her nothing and whose absence would cost her less, he saw the moment the relief arrived. It came into her face like warmth into a frozen hand, and she was too clumsy a creature to hide it. She thought she had won. She thought she had passed off spoiled goods and kept the sound. "Well," she said, and now the gracious smile came back, easier, greedy at the edges. "If your Grace prefers, Rena is a quiet, biddable girl. Plain, but there is no harm in her. If your Grace has taken a fancy—" "I have taken a debt," Corin said. "Fancy does not enter into it." By the window the girl turned her head. It was the first time she had truly looked him, and Corin, who had schooled his own face into stone before he was 30 and had not lost his footing behind it since, felt something small and unwelcome shift in his chest. Not attraction, not yet, nothing so simple, but recognition. She was looking at him the way he had learned to look at the world, measuring the harm, deciding how to survive it. There was no coyness in it and no pleading. There was fear, yes, she had heard the rumours, everyone had heard the rumours, but the fear was under her control, held down the way a rider holds down a frightened horse, by main strength and will. And beneath the fear in the set of her mouth, there was something he had not expected to find in that gilded, cruel little room. There was anger. Not at him. He saw that too, though he could not have said how he knew it. She was not angry to be given to him. She was angry to be given at all, to be a coin in her stepmother's purse, to have stood by a window her whole life while another girl was warmed by the fire, and to hear now that even her disposal was a bargain struck for someone else's comfort. He respected it. He would not have known how to say that either, but he did. Lady Marrowfield said, sharp now, turning in her chair, the sweetness gone the instant it was no longer needed. Come and make your curtsy to his grace. Don't stand there like a post. The girl came forward out of the shadow. She moved well, better than the room deserved, a straight-backed, unhurried grace that no one had taught her and no one had encouraged, that was simply hers. She curtsied to him, correct and cool, and rose, and looked him full in the face for the space of a breath. Your Grace, she said. Her voice was low and even. It did not shake. Miss Aldbury, Corin answered, because he had made it his business to learn the name of the debt before he came, and knew hers was Aldbury though the stepmother's was not. He saw the small surprise in her eyes that he knew it. Beatrix, by the fire, was frowning now, a child who had been promised a sweet and watched it handed to the servant. You understand what is proposed, he said to Rena. He did not soften it. He had found softening only made cruelty last longer. Your father died owing my house more than this estate is worth. Your stepmother cannot pay it. I do not need the money, I need a wife, for reasons of my own that are no concern of this room. The match cancels the debt entire. Marrowfield keeps its roof. You go from here to Bramhope in Yorkshire, and you do not come back to this house, and I do not imagine you will grieve that. Those are the terms. I will hear your answer, not hers. The room went very quiet. Lady Marrowfield had opened her mouth to answer for the girl and shut it again when he said the last 4 words, and now sat with high spots of colour burning on her cheeks, furious and trapped. Because he had made it plain that if she spoke he would take it as bad faith and be gone with the note in his hand. Rena looked at him. He watched her think. He liked that he could watch her think, that she did it openly, that she did not pretend to a maiden's fluttering confusion. She weighed him. She weighed the window she had spent her life beside, and the county that whispered about him, and the stepmother who would sell her again tomorrow if the price were right. And she came, quite visibly, to the end of the sum. Yes, she said, that was all. Not thank you, your Grace, not I am honoured, none of the syrup the mother would have poured over it. Just yes, the way a woman says yes to the only door in a burning house, knowing she cannot see what is on the other side and choosing it anyway because the room she stands in is on fire. Good, Corin said and stood. He was a tall man and he had learned to use it, and Lady Marrowfield came out of her chair too fast, flustered, all her practised graces scattered. Your Grace, surely the banns, the settlements, a proper courtship, a wedding cannot be arranged in a morning. It can be arranged in a fortnight, he said, drawing on his gloves. By special license, I have one. My man of business will call on Thursday with the papers. Sign them or do not, but if the ink is not dry by month's end, the note goes to my solicitors. And you will find them less agreeable company than I have been. He looked at Beatrix, who was gaping at him now with an expression of pure affront, as though the theft of a husband she had not wanted 5 minutes ago were a personal injury. Your daughter will make a fine match elsewhere, madam. She has been very carefully prepared for it. He heard, behind him as he turned, the small stifled sound of Rena Aldbury not quite laughing, a breath caught and held, quickly stilled. It pleased him more than anything had pleased him in a long time. At the door he paused, because there was one thing more, and it was the only kindness he permitted himself, for he had not much practice in kindness and did not trust his hand with it. He turned back to the girl. You will want a maid of your own, he said. Have you one you would keep? The question seemed to catch her off her guard more than anything else had. She had braced for cruelty, plainly, and had a wall built for it. A question about her comfort found no wall and went straight in. Something moved across her face, surprise, and under it, quickly hidden, a raw flash of something that might have been grief or hope, which in a face that has learned to want nothing can look very much the same. There is Nell, she said, in the kitchen. She was my mother's. Nell comes with you, Corin said, and did not look at the stepmother, who had begun to protest that Nell was needed, that Nell could not be spared, that really this was, and he let the door close on the sound of her, and went out into the grey day and did not know, walking to his carriage over the wet gravel of a house he despised, that he had just done the most important thing he would do in his life. The road to Yorkshire is long, and Corin Ashfield had 400 miles of it to think, and thinking was a thing he did too much and too well. He had not lied to the girl. He did need a wife for reasons of his own. His mother was dead and his father longer dead, and the Dukedom of Bramhope wanted in hair the way a great old tree past its prime wants a sapling planted in its shade, not for the tree's sake, which was near its ending, but for the grounds, which would be barren without it. There was a cousin, Aldous Ashfield, who stood next in the line, and Corin would have handed the whole cold weight of Bramhope to a beggar in the road before he handed it to Aldous. That was reason enough to marry, and reason enough to marry quickly, and reason enough, he had told himself. Choosing the plainest and least ambitious girl in that gilded room, to marry a woman who would want nothing from him but a roof and a settled peace, and would not go looking behind his silences for a heart he had stopped keeping 4 years ago. That was the plan. He had gone to Marrowfield to buy a peace. He had meant to take the pretty biddable one, the Beatrix, precisely because she was empty, because a woman like that would take his name and his money and his enormous echoing house and want nothing more of him, and he could go on being what he had become, which was alone. Instead, he had looked at the girl by the window and seen someone awake, and he had changed the plan on the spot, and he did not entirely know why, and it troubled him for 400 miles, because the rumors were true. Not the wild ones. He was not mad. He had not murdered anyone. He had no monstrous face beneath a mask, whatever the county liked to say over its cards of a winter evening. But the thing underneath the rumors, the thing that had made a young and wealthy and once charming duke into a recluse who came south only to collect a debt and take a bride like a man collecting a parcel, that was true, and it had a name, and the name was Cassandra. 4 years ago, Corin Ashfield had loved a woman, and had been going to marry her, and she had died. That was the short of it, and the short of it was a lie by omission, and he knew it, and he had never told anyone the long of it, and did not mean to. He had gone hard and gone silent and gone north, and he had let the county build whatever monster it liked out of the shape of a man who would not dance. It was easier to be a monster. A monster is left alone. He had thought he was taking a stranger to be that monster's wife. He had not reckoned on the anger in her face, or the yes that cost her, or the way she had said Nell was my mother's, 3 plain words that had told him more about her whole life than the stepmother's hour of chatter. He had not reckoned that she would be a person. He had wanted a wife who was furniture. He was bringing home, he began to suspect somewhere north of the second night's inn, a woman who was going to see him, really see him, the way she had seen the room at Marrowfield, and Corin Ashfield had spent 4 years arranging his life so that no one would ever see him again. The carriage climbed north through rain, and the country grew wilder as it went, the tame green of the south giving way to open moor, to grey stone and stinging weather and a sky that came down close. He watched it out the window with the collar of his coat turned up and thought, I should have taken the empty one. I should have taken the girl who would never look at me twice. And then, disloyal to his own resolve, unbidden, the memory of Rena Aldbury turning her head at the window. The anger held down, the yes chosen with open eyes came back to him, and something in his chest that he had believed frozen 4 years ago gave, very slightly the smallest possible fraction, the way river ice gives one warning creek in the last week before the thaw. He did not like it. He turned his collar higher and looked at the rain and told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong about that, as he was wrong about a great many things in those days, and he had a long winter ahead of him in which to learn how wrong. They were married on a Tuesday in the cold, small chapel at Marrowfield with no guests, but the necessary ones and a curate who kept glancing at the Duke as though he expected him at any moment to reveal a cloven hoof. Corin stood at the rail in his dark coat and made his responses in the flat, carrying voice he used for everything now, and beside him the girl in a made-over gown of her dead mother's, for the stepmother had grudged her even the price of new cloth, and Corin had noted it and said nothing, and would remember it, made hers as clearly and steadily as he did. When the curate reached the part about loving and cherishing, Corin felt her go very still beside him, and knew she was thinking, as he was, that neither of them meant a word of it, and that they had agreed silently, in the carriage of their separate resolves, to build a decent life on that shared and honest lie. Lady Marrowfield wept becomingly through the service, a performance for the curate. Beatrix did not come down at all, having taken to her room with a headache the day the settlement papers were signed, and Corin was glad of her absence, for the girl was one of those people whose disappointment fills a house. When it was done and the register signed, "Rena Ashfield," she wrote, in a clear, firm hand, and looked at the new name a moment before she set the pen down, the way a person looks at a country she has been exiled to and means to make the best of. The stepmother came forward with her arms out and a face full of maternal grief. And Corin watched his wife turn her cheek to be kissed with the exact composure of a woman receiving a stranger, and step back and not look back again. "You will write," Lady Marrowfield said, dabbing. "You will write to us, Rena. Blood is blood." "I will write when there is something to say," Rena answered, in a tone so level and so final that the stepmother's face, for one unguarded instant, showed what was beneath the powder. The small mean fury of a woman who has been read to the letter by someone she has spent 19 years believing beneath her notice. Then the powder settled back over it, and she smiled, and Corin handed his whip into the carriage and got in after her, and the wheels turned and Marrowfield fell away behind them into its own rot, and neither of them said anything at all until it was out of sight. It was Rena who broke the silence some miles on, looking out at the rain-dark hedgerows going by. "You did not have to bring Nell," she said. She did not look at him. "It cost you nothing to leave her. It would have been easier." "It cost me nothing to bring her," Corin said. "Bramhope is large. One more mouth is not felt. That is not why you did it." Now she turned and looked at him, and there was that same clear measuring regard he had felt across the drawing room, the one that went through the stone he had built and found the man behind it, or seemed to, which was worse. "You did it because you saw that she was the only creature in that house who loved me, and you did not want me to arrive at your monster's castle with nothing of my own. That was a kindness, your grace. I have not had many. I know the shape of one when it comes." Corin looked at her for a long moment. He was unaccustomed to being seen, and it sat on him uneasily like a coat cut for another man. He had thought a great deal on the road south and the road back about how to conduct this marriage, coolly, correctly, at a settled distance. Two civil strangers sharing a great house, and in time, the raising of an heir, without ever asking of each other the one thing he had decided he could not give and did not believe she wanted, which was to be known. And here, before they had even reached the first change of horses, she had knocked politely on the door of him and named what was inside. "Do not do that," he said. It came out harder than he meant it. "Do not make me a better man than I am, madam. You will be disappointed, and disappointment curdles. I brought you a maid because a wife should have a maid. Do not build a temple on it." He expected her to flinch or to sulk, or to arrange her face into the pretty wounded look that women deployed to make a man feel a brute. She did none of these. She considered his warning gravely, as though he had made her a reasonable point in an argument, and then she nodded once. "Very well," she said. "I will not think well of you until you have earned it. That is fair. I would ask the same." And she turned back to the window, and Corin found, to his considerable annoyance, that he was fighting the corner of his own mouth, which had for no reason he could defend decided to smile. Bramhope came into view on the fourth day, in the last hour of a failing afternoon, and Corin watched his wife see it for the first time. It was a hard house to love, and he knew it. It stood on a shoulder of the high moor, with nothing tame around it for miles, a great grey pile of a place. Older than the title, all blackened stone and mullioned windows, and a squat crenelated tower at the west end that had watched over 4 centuries of weather, and lost none of its grimness in the watching. Gardens his mother had loved had gone to seed after her death and never been revived. The long avenue of limes that led to the door had grown rank and unpruned. The fountain stood dry. It was a house that had stopped 4 years since, the way a clock stops when no one wins it, and Corin had let it stop because a stopped house asks nothing of a man. He watched Rena look at it, and he waited for the dismay he had seen on the faces of the few visitors he had not managed to turn away at the gates. The flicker of a person calculating how soon they might decently leave. It did not come. She looked at Bramhope the way he had watched her look at the drawing room and the new name in the register, steadily, taking its measure, and then, unexpectedly, with something that was almost tenderness. Her eyes went along the ruined avenue and up the black stone and across the dry fountains and the seeded beds, and when she spoke it was very quietly, and not, he thought, entirely to him. "It has been grieving," she said. Corin said nothing, he had not the words. No one in 4 years had looked at his cold, ruined house and named the thing at the bottom of it in 3 words, without cruelty and without fear. "It is not a monster's house," Renner went on, still looking. "A monster would have kept it splendid, to show off. This is the house of someone who stopped caring whether it fell down, 'cause caring hurt too much. I know what that looks like." She turned from the window then and looked at him, and her face was not soft. She did not pity him, and he was obscurely grateful for that. For he could not have borne pity, but it was open and it was honest, and it undid something in him he had spent 4 years tying tight. "I do not know what happened to you, your grace, and I will not ask. But I know a house that is in mourning, and I know it is not the same as a house that is dead. Mourning ends. Only dead is forever." The carriage rolled up the ruined avenue and stopped before the great door, and the servants came out, fewer than a house like Bramhope should have, and older. The loyal remnant who had stayed when the others drifted away from a master who no longer noticed them, and stood in a thin line in the failing light, and Corin got down and handed his wife out into the wind off the moor, and presented her to them as the Duchess of Bramhope. And watched them look at her, and watched her look at them. He saw the housekeeper, old Mrs. Peel, who had known him since he was a boy in short coats and had wept at his mother's grave and grieved him harder these 4 years than any of them, because she remembered what he had been. He saw Mrs. Peel look at the thin, plainly dressed girl in the dead woman's gown, and he saw the old servant's eyes fill, quite suddenly, with a hope so naked and so painful that Corin had to look away from it. He knew what she was thinking. She was thinking a lady in the house again. She was thinking, perhaps. She was thinking a fool's thought, and he meant to have a word with her later and put a stop to it, kindly, before it could grow. But Renner, Duchess of Bramhope, went along the thin line of servants in the cold, and stopped before each one, and asked each one's name, and repeated it back so she would keep it, and when she came to Mrs. Peel, who was crying now and mortified to be caught at it, the girl did a thing Corin had not taught her and could not have taught her, because he no longer knew how. She took the old woman's hand in both of hers in the wind, in front of everyone, and she said, "You loved his mother. I can see it. You will have to tell me about her, for I never had one long. And I should like to know whose gowns I am walking into her house in." And Mrs. Peel made a sound like a sob and a laugh together, and pressed the girl's hands, and Corin stood a little apart in the dark with the moor wind pulling at his coat and understood. With a cold, clear falling sensation that had nothing to do with the weather, that his plan had failed entirely. He had wanted a wife who was furniture. He had brought home a woman who, in the space of one arrival, in the space of 4 sentences on a windswept step, had begun to wake his stopped house from the outside in. He went in ahead of her, because he could not watch any longer. And he stood alone in the great cold hall where his boots rang on stone that had not heard a woman's voice in 4 years, and he put his hand flat against the black panelling as though to hold the house still, to keep it stopped, to keep it safe in its grief the way he kept himself safe in his. And behind him in the doorway, he heard his wife laugh at something Mrs. Peel had said, a real laugh, low and surprised, the first he had heard from her. And the sound went through the cold hall and up the great staircase and into the dark rooms above like water finding its way into ground that had forgotten rain. Corin took his hand from the wall. He did not want this. He had built his whole ruined life on not wanting this. And yet he stood in his own dark hall and listened to a stranger's laugh warm the air of it, and the frozen thing in his chest gave its second creak, louder than the first, and he thought with something close to despair, "I have made a terrible mistake, and I do not know how to unmake it. And I am not entirely certain I want to." That night he dined with her, because it would have been an insult not to, and because Mrs. Peel had laid the long table with the good plate for the first time in 4 years, and he had not the heart to send it away. They sat at opposite ends of a table built for 20, two small figures at the far poles of a wide white cloth, and the candles stood between them like a lit road neither of them crossed. They spoke little. He asked whether rooms were comfortable. She said they were, that Nell had already unpacked, that she had never in her life slept in a room where the fire was lit for her and not by her, and had said it plainly, without self-pity, as a fact he might like to know about the life he had married. He filed it away with the letting down of the hem and the gown at the wedding. He was building, without meaning to, a ledger of the small cruelties she had lived with, and he was finding that reading it made him angrier than he had been about anything in a long time, and the anger was inconvenient, because anger is a kind of caring, and he had given up caring. When the meal was done she rose, and thanked him gravely for it, and turned to go up to her cold end of the great house, for they had separate apartments, of course in the way of great houses. He had given no thought yet to the other, the hair, the reason he had married at all, and found he did not want to think of it, not yet, not while she was still a stranger who happened to be his wife. And at the door she stopped and looked back at him down the length of the candle-lit table. "Thank you for the house," she said. "You have not seen the house," Corin said. "It is cold, and it is falling down, and it is far from everything, and there is nothing here for a young woman." "There is quiet," Renna said. "There is a fire lit for me, and a maid who loves me, and an old woman who wept to see a lady come home, and there is no one in this house who will sell me tomorrow." She looked at him steadily down the long table, and the candlelight moved on her plain, composed face. "You think you have given me a prison, Your Grace. You have given me the first safe place I have had in 19 years. I know you don't mean to. That does not make it less true." And she made her curtsy and went, and Corin sat alone at the head of his own long table among the guttering candles and did not move for a very long time. There was a village below Bramhope, in the fold of the dale where the beck ran, a huddle of grey stone cottages and a squat old church and an inn called the Ashfield Arms that had not seen its lord across its threshold in 4 years, and it was there, before the frosts even hardened. The new Duchess did the second thing that undid Corin's careful plan for a marriage of distance, for she went down to it. He learned of it from Mrs. Peel, who reported it with the anxious pride of a woman uncertain whether she was betraying a confidence or sharing good news. The Duchess had taken the gig with Nell, and had gone down to the village of a market morning, and had walked among the stalls and the cottages, and had stopped, and asked names, and remembered them, and had gone into the poorest of the houses where the roofs leaked and a hard winter was coming, and had come back with a list, a plain list in her clear firm hand, of what wanted mending before the snow: this roof, that broken door, so many blankets, a physician for the smith's old mother who had a cough that would not clear. She had put the list on his library desk without a word and gone away, and Corin had found it there among his papers and sat looking at it a long time. His father would never have done such a thing. His father had regarded the village as a rent roll and nothing more. His mother had done it once. Long ago, Corin remembered, dimly being carried through the village as a small boy on her hip, remembered her stopping at doors, remembered the way the faces changed when she came, and after her death no one had done it, least of all Corin, who in his grief had let the whole of Bramhope go to seed, tenants and roofs and all, because he had not been able to see past the wall of himself to the fact that other people's roofs leaked whether or not a duke was grieving. He mended the roofs. He did it because she had made the list. And he told himself it was only good management, a landlord's plain duty long neglected, and it was that. But it was also that he found, riding down into the village a fortnight later to see the work begun, with his wife beside him on his mother's grey mare, that the faces at the doors changed when she passed exactly as they had changed for his mother 40 years before, and that some of them, the older ones, the ones who remembered, looked from the Duchess to the Duke and back, and that something moved in those weathered faces that Corin had not seen turned on himself in 4 years, and had thought he never would again. It was not fear. That was the thing. The county gentry feared him over their cards and enjoyed the fearing, for a monster is a delicious thing to have in the next valley. But the village did not fear him. The village had known his mother and remembered his father, and had watched him grow from the boy on the hip to the young man who danced too loud to the recluse in the tower, and the village, he understood, riding through it with his wife, had never quite believed the tales, had only been waiting patiently, in the way of people who live close to the hard turning of the seasons and know that most dead things are only dormant for their lord to come back to himself. And here he was, come down among them with a duchess who made lists of leaking roofs, and the village looked at him not as at a monster, but as at a man late home from a long journey, and welcomed him without a word by the simple act of not being afraid. "They liked your mother," Rena said, low, as they rode back up the dale in the thin autumn light. It was not a question. She had watched the faces too. "They did," Corin said. "I had forgotten. I have spent 4 years so certain I was hated that I forgot there were people who did not hate me, who were only waiting for me to be worth the loving again. You have a way of making me remember things I had buried. It is not always comfortable. Comfort is overpraised," Rena said. "I was comfortable at Marrowfield, in a manner of speaking. I knew exactly where I stood and exactly how little I was wanted, and there was a certain rest in never having to hope for better. You have made me deeply uncomfortable, Your Grace, since the day you looked at the wrong daughter. I have had to start hoping again. It is the most uncomfortable thing in the world." She was smiling as she said it, the low private smile she kept for him, and he understood the shape of the gift she was making him, which was to say that he had done to her exactly what she had done to him. Woken a thing that had been sleeping in the cold because sleeping was safer, and made it get up and hope and live. There was the matter of Nell too, which Corin came to value more than he would have thought a servant could be valued. For Nell, a broad, plain, fierce woman of 50 who had been Rena's mother's maid and had stayed on at Marrowfield through 19 years for no reason under heaven but love of the dead woman's child. Nell was the one living witness to the whole of Rena's history, and Corin, who wished to know his wife entire, took to seeking the old servant out. It was not done for a duke to sit in a still room and drink tea with his wife's maid, and Mrs. Peel was scandalized and delighted by turns. But Corin had lost his taste for what was done, and he wanted, badly, to know the girl who had turned her head at the window, and Nell was the book of her. So Nell told him over the winter, in pieces, that Rena's mother had died when the girl was 5 of a fever, and that her father had grieved and then, weakly, remarried within the year, wanting a manager for his house and getting a viper for his child, that the stepmother had never struck the girl, being too careful for that, but had done the slower, crueler thing, had starved her of every warmth and given it all to Beatrix before her eyes, had made her a servant in her own father's house in all but name while calling her daughter to the world's face, that the girl had never once complained, not to her father before he died, not to anyone, because she had learned that complaint only sharpened the cruelty and that silence starved it, that she had taught herself to read from books left out and to ride on a borrowed cob and to hope for nothing, and had built, out of a child's raw endurance, the straight-backed, unflinching woman who had walked into Bramhope in a dead woman's gown and named the house's grief in 3 words. She never cried where they could see, Nell said, fierce and low over her tea. Not once, in all those years, would she let them see. I'd find her aft in the linen room in the dark, where she thought no one, and even then she'd not make a sound. Silent, always silent, so as they'd never have the satisfaction. It near broke my heart, that silence. A child ought to be able to howl. She never learned how. The old woman looked at him then, straight, with something that was half a warning and half a plea. She's learned to be happy here, Your Grace. I've watched it come on her these months like the spring. I never thought to see it. And I'll tell you plain, because there's no one else will, if you break that, if you're one more that lifts her up only to let her fall, you'll answer to me, Duke or no. But I don't think you will. I've watched you too. You look at her the way her father ought to have and never did. You look at her like she's worth something. That's all she ever wanted, the whole of her life. Just for someone to look at her like she was worth something. Corin had not been able to answer that for a moment. When he did, it was only to say, she is worth everything, and Nell had nodded, satisfied, as though that were the right answer to a catechism she had set, and had poured him more tea, and after that day the old servant was his ally as fiercely as she was her mistress's, and it was Nell, in the end, sharp-eyed, watchful, distrustful of Aldous from the first bow, who would notice in the summer to come that the smooth cousin had been seen too near the stables of an evening, and would say so to Mrs. Peel, who would say so to the groom, so that the groom slept among the horses. A small thing, a servant's watchfulness. One of 100 small guards that love had set around Rena without her knowing, any one of which might have caught the cut girth, and one of which, in the person of a husband grown watchful with loving, did. But all that was still to come, in the deep of that first winter. Before the letter and the cousin and the knife, there were only the two of them, and the great house learning to be warm, and the village learning to see its lord again, and the old maid keeping her fierce watch, and the slow, unlooked for, entirely undeserved gift. Corin thought of it exactly so, as undeserved, and never lost the wonder of it, of a marriage made to pay a debt, turning, week by frozen week, into the first true home that either of the two lonely people in it had ever known. He would remember, always, one particular night from the black heart of that winter. Waking in the deep cold before dawn to the sound of the wind round the tower, and lying still and hearing, very faint, from along the passage where her rooms were, before ever the passages grew shorter between them, the low tuneless hum of his wife awake in the dark, humming the nameless song her true mother must have left her, not from sorrow, he somehow knew, but from contentment, the sound a person makes who has, against all the evidence of her whole life, come at last to a place of rest. And Corin Ashfield had lain in the dark of the house he had let die, and listened to that small human sound of a happiness he had made possible almost by accident, and had felt the last of the 4 years' ice go out of him entirely, and had understood, then in the cold before the dawn, that he was not going to be able to keep his careful distance after all, that he was going to love this woman with the whole of the reckless heart he had sworn never to use again, and that it was, whatever it cost him, whatever fate made him pay for it, the only thing left in the world worth doing. The winter closed over Bramhope, and the two strangers who had married learned the shape of each other slowly, the way two people learn a dark room by the bark shin, the found chair, the gradual mapping of where things stood. Corin had expected her to shrink into the great house and be swallowed by it. That was what happened to people at Bramhope. The moor and the cold and the silence pressed them small until they left. Instead, his wife spread through it like light through a shuttered room where one shutter has been opened, then two. It began with the fires. Within a week there were fires lit in rooms that had stood cold for 4 years, and the damp smell that had crept into the house began, slowly, to retreat. It went on with the beds. She had found on some cold exploration the linen presses in the east wing full of good sheets gone yellow with disuse, and she had them aired and mended, and Mrs. Peel, who had not been able to get the moss to notice the house at all, discovered in the new Duchess someone who noticed everything, and the two of them fell into a conspiracy of small repairs that Corin pretended not to see. A cracked pane replaced, the rank limes along the avenue cut hard back, so that light came down the drive again. The dry fountain in the south court scoured out, and one bright hard morning in February made to run. Corin came out of the library at the sound of it, the sound of water in his mother's court that he had not heard in 4 years, and stood at the window and could not for a moment breathe. He found her in the walled garden that afternoon, on her knees in the wet black earth in an old apron of Mrs. Peel's, cutting away 4 years of dead growth from beds his mother had planted, and he stood in the arch of the wall and watched her a while before she knew he was there. Her hands were filthy, and there was a smear of earth on her cheek, and her dark hair had come down at one side, and she was frowning in concentration at a rose gone to a thicket of dead canes, and she looked, Corin thought, and hated himself a little for thinking it, happier than he had ever seen a person look at Bramhope. "You are ruining your hands," he said. She did not startle. She had grown used to him appearing in doorways. She said once that he moved through his own house like a man who did not want to be certain it was still there. She sat back on her heels and looked at her filthy hands and then at him. "My hands have been ruined by worse than honest dirt," she said. "You would be surprised what a stepmother finds for idle hands, your grace. This, at least, grows something back." She turned to the murdered rose. "Your mother planted this, Mrs. Peel says. It is not dead. It only thinks it is. There is green under the bark if you scrape it." She scraped a cane with her thumbnail to show him, and there it was, the thin green line under the grey. "Everything at Bramhope is like this. It only thinks it is dead." Corin looked at the green line under the bark and did not answer. because he understood that she was no longer talking about the rose and had not, perhaps, been talking about the rose for some time, and he was not ready, he was nowhere near ready to be the thing she was scraping to find the green in. But he came out to the garden again the next day, though he told himself it was to inspect the wall, and the day after that, though he no longer bothered with the excuse, and a week into March, without quite deciding to. He took up a pair of shears and cut back the tangle of an old apple that she could not reach, and worked beside her for an hour in the cold bright air without speaking, and when he went in his hands was scratched and his mind, for the first time in 4 years, was quiet. He began, against every intention, to look forward to her. That was the thing that frightened him. Not the marriage. The marriage was a contract, and contracts he understood, but the small daily creep of gladness that had begun to attend her. The way he found himself listening for her voice in the passage, the way the great cold house had rearranged itself in his mind, so that the rooms she was in were warm and the rooms she was not in were merely rooms. He had felt this once before. He knew where it went. He knew what was at the bottom of it, and he had climbed out of that pit at terrible cost and had sworn never to go near the edge again, and here he was leaning over. So he told her about Cassandra. He did it deliberately one evening in the library, as a man might build a wall to keep himself in. He had not meant to speak of it ever. He spoke of it now precisely because she was becoming dear to him, to remind them both what he was. "You have not asked," he said, into a silence, "what happened to me. Why the house is as it is. Why the county says what it says." Rena set down her book. She was curled in the great chair by the fire that had become hers, and the firelight was on her face, and she looked at him and waited, and did not prompt him, which he was grateful for. If she had prompted him, he could not have gone on. Her name was Cassandra Varel, Corin said. He looked at the fire, not at his wife. "We were to be married. That was 5 years ago. I was a different man then. You would not know me. I danced. I laughed too loud at cards. I thought the world had been arranged for my particular pleasure, because so far it had. And I loved her, or I loved what I thought she was, which is not the same thing, though it took me a long time and a great deal of grief to learn the difference." He stopped. The fire snapped. Rena said nothing, only watched him, and the watching was somehow easier to bear than any words would have been. "There was a night," he said, "a house party in the spring at a place in the next county. There was a lake. She had quarrelled with me that evening over nothing. Over some slight she imagined. She was a great one for imagined slights, though I did not see it then. I saw only that I had displeased her, and it undid me, and she went out to the lake in the dark, alone, in a temper, to make me follow and be sorry, and I did not follow. That is the whole of it, and it is unforgivable, and I have not been forgiven, least of all by myself. I let her go out into the dark angry, and I sat at the cards to punish her back, because I was young and proud and a fool, and she went out on the lake in a little boat that no one should have taken out night, and he could not say the word. In 4 years he had never once said the word aloud. Rena did not make him say it. "And you have carried it since," she said quietly, "that if you had followed her, she would be living." "Yes. And the county says you drove her to it, or worse. The county says a great many things. That I struck her, that there was another woman, that I let her drown out of jealousy and watched from the bank. Some of them believe I did it with my own hands." He laughed, a short ugly sound with no humor in it. "It does not matter what they believe. What matters is what is true, and what is true is bad enough. I did not follow her. I chose my pride over her safety, and she died of it, and I have spent 4 years making certain I would never again be in a position to choose wrongly, by arranging never to care for anyone at all. That is the man you married, madam. That is what is under the house. Now you know it, and you may make of it what you will, but do not," and here his voice, which had been steady, went rough, "do not scrape at the bark to find the green in me. There is no green in me. There is only a man who let a woman die of his pride, and who does not deserve, and does not want to be scraped at." The fire snapped, the wind went round the tower, and Rena Ashfield sat and looked at her husband for a long time in the firelight, and when at last she spoke, it was not what he had braced for. It was not pity, and it was not reassurance, and it was not the pretty grief women poured over a wound to seem tender. "That is a terrible story," she said, and I am sorry for it, and I am sorry for her, and I am most sorry for the boy of 31 who has spent 4 years believing he is the villain of it. But I will tell you what I hear in it, your grace, since you have told it to me, and you may make of that what you will." She sat forward, and the firelight moved on her plain, grave, honest face. "I hear a young man whose betrothed used her own safety as a weapon against him. Who went out alone in the dark, in a temper, in a boat at night, to frighten and punish the man she meant to marry. That is not love. I have lived 19 years with people who used their pain to punish me, and I know the shape of it, and I am telling you that is what I hear. She did a reckless, cruel thing, and it went wrong, as reckless, cruel things do, and it is a tragedy, but it is her tragedy first, and yours second, and the part of it that is yours is not the murder you have made of it. Your part is that you were young and proud and stayed at the cards. That is a fault, it is not a crime. You have spent 4 years hanging a boy for a fault." Corin sat very still. No one had ever said such a thing to him. No one had dared, and no one had wanted to, because the version in which he was the monster was easier for everyone, himself included. A monster at least has done something. A monster has a reason to be left alone. He had built 4 years of stone on the certainty of his own guilt, and this thin girl in his dead mother's chair had reached out one plain hand and set it gently against the wall, and he could feel the whole edifice for the first time, wondering whether it might move. "You did not know her," he said. It was all he had. "No," Rena agreed, "but I know you a little now. I know a man who cut back an apple tree he could have left, and had a fountain run he could have left dry, and brought a maid 400 miles for a wife he did not want to care about. I know a man who is gentler than he will allow, and lonelier than he can bear, and so frightened of doing harm that he has done the greatest harm of all, which is to lock the whole of himself away where it can neither hurt nor help a living soul." She rose and set her book aside, and came across the room, and stood for his chair, and looked down at him, this girl he had bought to pay a debt, standing over the Duke of Bramhope in his own library and telling him the truth of himself as no one had ever dared. "You are not a monster, Corin. You are a good man who has decided that the safest thing to be is nothing at all. And it is not safe, it is only slow. You are drowning too. You are only doing it in a house instead of a lake, and taking longer." She had used his name. She had never used his name before. It had been, your grace, always a careful hedge between them, and now she had said Corin once, quietly in the firelight, and the sound of it in her low, even voice went through him, the first crack of the going through the whole frozen river at once. And Corin Ashfield, 9th Duke of Bramhope, who had not wept in 4 years, who had not permitted himself so much as the softening of his own face, felt his eyes sting and burn and had to turn them to the fire so that she would not see. She saw. Of course she saw. She saw everything. It was the terrible gift of her. But she did not remark on it, and she did not reach for him, and she did not press her small victory, which would have been the cruelest thing and the most human. She only said, very gently, "Good night, your grace again," giving him back the hedge, giving him back his cover, because she understood that he could not yet be seen and would not shame him for it. And she took up her candle and went, and left him alone with the fire and the wind and the first tears he had shed in 4 years, which came slow and hard and silent, and which he did not entirely understand, except that they did not feel like grief. They felt like ground remembering rain. Spring came to the moor the way it comes to hard country, late, and all at once and grudging, and then suddenly everywhere. The limes leafed. The scoured beds Rena had cleared put up green in ordered rows. And something between the Duke and his Duchess, which had been thawing all winter by fractions, came into a kind of quiet flower that neither of them named, because to name it would have been to test it, and it was too new and too precious to be tested yet. They rode together now, most mornings, out onto the high moor where the curlews cried, and Corin found that she rode, as she did everything, with a straight-backed, fearless ease that had come from somewhere and been encouraged by no one. She had learned, she told him, on a farmer's cob, in secret as a girl, before her father died, and her stepmother came and put a stop to anything that might give her pleasure. Corin had his groom bring up a grey mare from the far pasture, pretty gentle-mouthed thing that had been his mother's and had run idle for 4 years, and gave it to his wife without ceremony, leaving it saddled in the yard one morning so that she came upon it and understood. And he watched from the library window as she stood in the yard with her hand on the mare's neck and her face turned away from the house so that he should not see it, and he understood that she was weeping and that she did not want him to know. Exactly as he had not wanted her to know in the firelight, and he loved her for it. There he had thought the word, loved, and did not take it back, for it was love now. He knew it, and it terrified him, and he could no longer pretend it was anything else. It was love in the way he listened for her, love in the way the house arranged itself around her, love in the way he found himself at his solitary work in the library, saving up small things to tell her, a heron on the beck, a line in a book. A memory of his mother that had surfaced for the first time in years without the old accompanying pain. He had spent 4 years making certain he would never again be in a position to lose someone, and he had lost that battle utterly, in a walled garden, to a girl with dirt on her cheek. And the strange thing, the thing he turned over and over in the long light evenings, was that he no longer wished he had won it, and yet he did not go to her. The marriage remained, in the one particular that great houses arranged for and the world expected, unconsummated. He had told himself at first that it was decency, that a woman handed over to pay a debt should not be pressed, that he would not add himself to the ledger of things done to her against her will. That had been true and honorable, and he had been proud of it. But it had ceased to be the whole truth some weeks past, and he knew it, and the whole truth was harder and more shaming. He was afraid. He was afraid that to reach for her fully, to make her wholly his wife in body as she had become in every other way his wife in fact, was to hand fate the weapon it had used on him before, to care so much that the losing of it would end him. He had loved a woman once with his whole reckless heart, and she had died, and some cold cowardly stone at the bottom of him whispered that if he only kept back this last part, this last door, then whatever came he would survive it, as he had survived before, by the margin of what he had refused to give. Rena knew, of course Rena knew, there was nothing about him she did not, in time, come to know. But she did not press, and she did not reproach, and she did not, as another woman might have, and been within her rights, treat his holding back as a slight upon herself. She simply waited, with the same steady patience she had brought to the murdered rose, understanding better than he did that some green things cannot be forced and will come, if they come at all, in their own late season. It was into this fragile flowering that the letter came. Corin knew the hand at once, and the sight of it turned his stomach. Lady Marrowfield's, that over-flourished, ingratiating script, the loops of it like a woman curtsying too low. He had had 2 such letters over the winter and burned them both unanswered. They had been all sugar, my dear daughter, my dearest Duke, so happy to think of our 2 houses joined, and beneath the sugar the unmistakable probing of a creature testing whether there was more to be got. This one was thicker. He did not burn it. He read it standing at the library window with the spring light coming down the newly opened avenue, and as he read, the light seemed to go out of the day. The letter was full of grief. Beatrix, it said, was in a decline. Beatrix had never recovered from the disappointment of the winter, for the Duke must understand that the poor child had formed an attachment, had believed herself as good as promised, and to see the honour go to a step-sister had wounded her past bearing. The physicians despaired. Beatrix wasted. And a mother's heart, the letter said, could not but wonder whether the Duke, in his great generosity, might not find it in him to make some provision, for the girl had been so cruelly used by fate, and a small settlement, a modest annual sum, a token of the family feeling that surely still bound their 2 houses, might do so much to restore her spirits and ease a widowed mother's care. It was, stripped of its lace, a demand for money dressed as a sick-bed. Corin had read 100 such in his time. He knew exactly what it was. And he would have crumpled it and thrown it in the cold grate and thought no more of it, except for the last paragraph, which was where Lady Marrowfield, who was cunning but not clever, showed her true hand, for she could not resist. She never could. Having asked for money, she reached for the whip she thought would fetch it, and the whip was Rena. You will forgive a mother's frankness, the letter said, but I must in conscience own to some unease on your own account, dear Duke. Rena is my late husband's child, and I have loved her as my own. But I should be forced to you, who have shown our family such honour, if I did not confess that the girl has ever been of a willful and secretive nature, given to sullen fits and to fancies, and I write this with the greatest reluctance, was believed by some in the county before her marriage to have formed an unsuitable and clandestine attachment to a young man quite beneath her, one which her poor father's death alone prevented from ripening into open disgrace. I say nothing of the truth of it. I say only that a husband so generous as yourself has a right to know the character of what has been placed in his keeping, and that I remain, in all things, your most affectionate and devoted. Corin read the paragraph 3 times. The first time, cold rage rose in him so fast that he had to set the paper down on the sill and grip the stone edge of the window with both hands until it passed, because he knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the fact that he had spent a winter learning his wife, that it was a lie. It was a lie of exactly the kind the woman had told all her life, a lie shaped to look like reluctant honesty, a lie with a barb on the end so that it would catch in a man's mind and sit there festering. There'd been no young man beneath her. He knew Rena. He knew the shape of her honesty the way he knew the shape of the moor from his own window, and this did not fit it anywhere. The second time he read it, the cold rage turned colder still, into understanding, and the understanding was worse than the rage. He saw the whole of the woman's design laid out like a hand of cards turned face up. She had lost her Beatrix's chance at a duke, and she meant to be paid for it. That was the annuity dressed as a sickbed. But she was cunning enough to bring more than one weapon, and the second weapon was this: to poison him against his wife. To plant in the mind of a man the whole county believed a jealous monster, a man who was said to have let one woman die of his jealousy, the seed of a suspicion about the fidelity of the second. She did not know, could not know what had truly passed between Corin and his duchess over the winter. She was working blind, throwing poison at a marriage she assumed to be as cold and transactional as the one she had sold. But if that poison took root, if the monster the county whispered of turned his jealousy on the wife who had begun at last to wake him, then Rena would be wretched, and a wretched Rena would want her stepmother's protection, and a stepmother's protection has a price. And round the woman's mind ran on the single track it had always run on, which was, what can I get, and whom must I hurt to get it? The third time he read it, Corin Ashfield set the letter down very carefully on the sill, and found that his hands had stopped shaking, and that he was, in the cold, clear centre of himself, more certain of one thing than he had been of anything in 4 years. He was going to protect her. Not the way he had failed to protect Cassandra, not with a mad ride into the dark, not with grief, not with a monster's rage that would only prove the county right. He was going to protect her the way a man protects the one thing he has found in a wrecked life worth keeping, coldly, cleverly, completely, and without ever letting the person he was protecting carry the weight of the threat. Rena had spent 19 years being the one who bore the cruelty and shielded no one, for no one had shielded her. She was not going to bear this. He would take it. He would stand between her and it, and she would never even know how close the poison had come, unless and until he chose to tell her. And then, standing at the window with the spring light on the avenue his wife had opened to the sun, Corin understood the last thing, the thing that had been true for weeks, and that the letter, of all unlikely instruments, had at last plain to him. He had told himself he held back from her out of fear of loving too much, of handing fate a weapon, but fear had never in his life made him better. It had only ever made him stay at the cards while the boat went out on the lake. Fear was the thing that had killed Cassandra, not his jealousy, whatever the county said, but his cowardice, the small proud cowardice that had let him sit still while someone he loved went out alone into the dark. He had sworn to never again be in a position to lose someone by holding back. But he had had it backwards the whole time, for 4 years in the cold and the silence. It was not the caring that had cost him, it was the not following. It was the holding back. He would not hold back again. He folded Lady Marrowfield's letter into a small hard square and put it into the breast of his coat, against his heart, where it could remind him, and he went to find his wife. He found her in the walled garden, as he had known he would, on her knees among the roses in the long gold light of the evening, and he stood in the arch of the wall and looked at her for a moment, the woman he had bought to pay a debt, whose stepmother had just tried to sell him a lie about her. And then he crossed the garden and knelt down in the wet earth beside her, in his good coat, without a word. Rena looked at him sidelong, surprised. It was not his hour to be in the garden, and he did not, as a rule, kneel in the dirt in his coat. "There is earth on your knee," she said. "There is," Corin agreed. He did not brush it off. He had spent 4 years keeping himself immaculate and apart, above the dirt of living, and he found he was done with it. He looked at her hands in the soil and then at her face, and he said the thing he had come to say, plainly, because he had learned from her that the plain thing said plainly was the only thing worth saying at all. "I have been a coward with you, Rena. Not unkind, I hope, but a coward. I have kept a door shut between us because I was afraid of what would come through it if I opened it. I was afraid that if I let myself love you, and I do love you, I have loved you since the walled garden, since the rose, I have known it and hidden it and been a fool. I was afraid that to love you would be to hand fate the knife it used on me before, so I held back. I have held back my whole self from you for months and called it decency, and it was fear, and I am ashamed of it, and I am done with it. That is what I came to say." Rena had gone very still. The gold light was on her face and her eyes were bright. And for a moment the composure that never left her, the wall she had built in 19 years of being handed about, trembled, and he saw the girl beneath it, the girl no one had ever chosen, the girl who had said yes to a monster because it was the only door in a burning house. "You do not have to love me," she said, and her low voice was not quite steady now. "That was never in the bargain. I did not come here expecting." "I know what you came here expecting," Corin said. "You came here expecting a prison and a monster and a life of being tolerated at the far end of a long cold table. And I very nearly gave it to you out of my own cowardice, and you would have borne it because you have borne everything and never once made me feel the weight of it. That is precisely why I will not give it to you." He reached out and took one of her earth-dark hands in both of his, not caring for the dirt, and held it. "I did not choose you at the first. I told you the truth in that drawing room. I took a debt, not a wife. But I choose you now. Do you understand me? Whatever I took you for, I keep you for this, because you saw a dead house and called it grieving, because you scraped the bark to find the green when I told you there was none, because you are the bravest and the kindest and the least self-pitying creature I have ever known. And because I would rather be afraid every day for the rest of my life of losing you than spend one more hour safe and frozen without you. That is what I came to say. I have said it badly, but I have said it." For a moment Rena did not speak. Then she turned her hand in his, so that her earth-stained fingers laced through his own, and she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, there in the roses, in the gold light, and Corin felt her shoulders shake once silently, and understood that she was weeping. Not the guarded weeping she hid from him at the window and in the yard, but weeping that she was letting him see, which was the greater gift, the harder gift, the surrender of the lost thing she had kept back as surely as he had kept back his. "I did not let myself hope for this," she said against his coat, muffled. "I would not let myself. Hoping was the thing that hurt worst, growing up, hoping the next thing would be kinder, and it never was, so I taught myself not to. And then I came here, and you kept being gentle, and I kept telling myself it meant nothing, that I must not build a temple on it. You told me so yourself." "I was a fool when I told you that," Corin said into her hair. "Build the temple. I will help you carry the stone." She laughed at that, wet and startled, and lifted her face, and it was streaked with tears and earth, and it was, to him, in that moment, more beautiful than any polished face in any ballroom he had ever fled, and he took it between his 2 hands and kissed her, there in the walled garden, in his mother's roses, in the last gold light of a spring evening on the high moor, the first time and long overdue, and worth every day of the wait. And so the marriage that had been made to pay a debt became, that spring, the true thing it had only pretended to be, became a marriage in every sense the world meant, and in a great many senses the world had never troubled to imagine. The long cold table grew shorter. They took to dining side by side at one end of it, in a scandal of intimacy that Mrs. Peel reported to the kitchen with tears of joy. The separate apartments in the great house grew, in the natural course of a love no longer held back, less separate. And the particulars of that the tale draws its curtain across, as a decent tale should, saying only that Corin Ashfield, who had spent 4 years certain he would never again lie easy beside another living soul, came in that season to know the particular peace of waking in the dark to the quiet breathing of a woman who had chosen to stay, and to feel, in place of the old cold dread, a gratitude so large it frightened him nearly as much as the fear had. He did not tell her about the letter. That was the one thing he kept from her, and he kept it out of love and not out of cowardice, and he knew the difference now. He answered Lady Marrowfield himself, in his own cold, flat hand, 3 lines, that he was in good health and in full possession of his understanding, that he wished Miss Beatrix swift recovery from an ailment he did not for a moment credit, and that he would not be sending money, now or ever, to a household that had lied to him twice, and that any further correspondence in a similar vein would be answered by his solicitors and not by himself. He did not mention the slander against his wife. He would not dignify it by naming it. But he had it, folded small against his heart, and he did not forget it, and he did not for a moment believe that a woman like Lady Marrowfield, having failed with sugar and failed with poison, would simply put down her cards and go away. He was right. It was Aldous who came. Corin's cousin arrived in June, unannounced, in a hired chaise, with 2 trunks and the air of a man who intended to stay. Aldous Ashfield, the heir presumptive, the cousin to whom the whole of Bramhope would fall if Corin died without a son, a smooth, high-coloured, laughing man of 40 who had spent his life on the near edge of ruin, always one loan ahead of his creditors, always charming, always watching. Corin had not seen him in years and had been glad of it. He came out to the hall to the sound of the chaise and found his cousin already inside, already handing his hat to a startled footman, already smiling. "Cousin," Aldous cried, as though they were the fondest of friends, which they had never been. "You are looking, well, you are looking alive, which is more than the county gives you credit for. And married, I had the news in town. Married, and never a word to your own blood, and to a little nobody from the south with not a penny. Corin, you sly creature, there is a story there." "There is always a story with you." His pale eyes went round the hall, quick and greedy, taking in the fresh paint and the aired rooms and the flowers on the great table, and Corin saw the calculation move behind them exactly as he had seen it move behind Lady Marrowfield's, and understood that the 2 of them had found each other. Of course they had. Ruin knows ruin. A stepmother with a slander to sell and a cousin with an inheritance to protect were made to meet, and somewhere in a London coffee-house or a country coaching inn they had met, and here was the result, smiling in his hall with 2 trunks. Aldous, Corin said, "What do you want?" "Want," his cousin laughed. "Can a man not visit his only living kinsman? Can a man not wish to meet the new Duchess of whom the whole county is talking? And they are talking, Corin, I will not deceive you. They talk of very little else, of the mystery bride, the pauper bride, the girl the mad Duke of Bramhope carried off to his tower. You should hear them. It is quite a romance. Some of it is even kind." He smiled, and the smile did not reach his pale watching eyes. "I only thought, as you're here, cousin, as the man whose whole future rests, let us be frank, on the question of whether you get a son of your own, that I had a family interest in coming to see for myself what manner of woman you have brought into the succession. Purely a family interest. You will not grudge me that." And Corin, looking at his cousin's smiling, hungry, dangerous face in the hall of the house he had at last brought back to life, understood with a calling clarity that the threat to everything he had found was no longer a letter he could fold and put away. It had walked in through his own front door with 2 trunks and a laugh, and it meant to stay until it found the thing it had come for, a crack, a lever, a way to be sure that Bramhope in the end came to Aldous and not to any son of the pauper bride, and that it would use without scruple whatever it found. Rena came into the hall then, from the garden, in her old apron with roses in her hands. She stopped when she saw the stranger, and Corin watched his cousin turn and see her, see the plain, earth-smudged, unfashionable girl he had been told was a scheming nobody. And he watched Aldous's whole face rearrange itself in an instant into charm, into warmth, into the practiced, delighted deference of a man who has just decided how he will play his hand. "But this cannot be the Duchess," Aldous said, sweeping into a bow. "This lovely creature." "Cousin, you undersold her shamefully. Madam, I am Aldous Ashfield, your husband's devoted cousin and most humble servant. come all this way for the sole joy of making your acquaintance." And Rena, with roses in her hands and earth on her cheek, looked at the smiling man bowing over nothing, and then passed him to her husband, and Corin saw in her steady eyes the same thing he had felt, that she knew as he knew exactly what had just walked into the house. She had been read by Cruelty and had learned to read it back. She made her curtsy, cool and correct, and she said, "You are welcome to Bramhope, Mr. Ashfield," in a voice that welcomed him precisely as much as the moor welcomes weather, and Corin, watching, felt something settle in him that was almost like relief. He would not face this one alone. That was the difference. 4 years ago he had faced the dark alone and lost. This time there were two of them, and they had already, without a word, taken up their positions back to back. Aldous stayed a week, and then he stayed a fortnight, and each day Corin watched him work. He was good at it. Corin gave him that. He was charming to the servants and 1-2 of the younger ones. He was deferential to Rena and full of admiration, always admiring, always watching to see what his admiration did. He rode out with Corin and talked of old times that had never been fond, and asked, lightly, as though it were nothing, about the marriage, how it had come about, what settlements had been made, whether the Duchess had brought anything to it at all, whether Corin was quite certain of her people. And when Corin gave him nothing, for Corin had learned coldness in a hard school and could outwait any man, Aldous only smiled and turned the talk, and Corin knew he had merely moved to the next approach. The next approach was Rena. Corin came in from the stables one grey afternoon and heard his cousin's voice in the small morning room where his wife sat with her mending, and something in the pitch of it made him stop in the passage, unseen, and listen, a thing he was not proud of. But a man who has been warned learns to gather what he can. Only that I should be a poor cousin, Aldous was saying, in the warm confiding tone he used, if I did not give you a word of caution, madam, one woman's champion to another, as it were. For you are new to this county, and you cannot know what is said, and it is better you should hear it from a friend than have it flung at you cold in some drawing-room. They say, I am sorry to be the one, they say hard things of my cousin, of the first betrothal, of the lake. You will have heard some of it, but there is a part you may not have heard, and it touches you, and so in conscience I must, a pause, delicate, practised. There are those who wonder, madam, given his history, given what is whispered of his temper when he is crossed in love, whether a young wife in a lonely house so far from all her friends is altogether safe. I say nothing of my own knowledge. I love my cousin. But I could not sleep easy, madam, if I did not make certain you knew you had a friend in the family, one to whom you might turn, should you ever find yourself afraid. Corin stood in the passage and felt the old rage rise and mastered it, because he understood now what he was hearing. This was the second half of the design. Lady Marrowfield had tried to poison him against his wife. Failing that, here was Aldous trying to poison the wife against him, to frighten her, to plant the county's monster in her mind, to make her afraid of her own husband, so that she might be turned, or driven off, or, at the very least, so that when the time came Aldous would have a witness, a frightened duchess who could be brought to say she had feared him, which in a court of law and the court of opinion alike might be worth a great deal to a man contesting a succession. It was clever. It was patient. It was exactly the kind of slow cruelty that Rena had grown up inside of, and Corin's whole soul rose up in fury that it had followed her here, into the one safe place she had ever had. He did not go in. He waited to hear what she would do, because he had learned that she did not need his rescuing half so often as he wished to give it, and because some part of him needed badly to hear it. There was a silence. Then Rena's low, even voice, unhurried, entirely calm. "Mr. Ashfield," she said, "I am going to tell you something, and I am going to tell it to you plainly, because I think we understand each other better than we have pretended, and I am weary of the pretending. I grew up in a house with a woman who spoke exactly as you are speaking now. So gentle, so concerned, so very much my friend when it suited her, and always for my own good. I have heard I only tell you this because I care for you in more voices than you would credit, and it always meant the same thing, which was, I want a thing from you, or through you, and I have decided to frighten you into giving it, so you will forgive me if I am not frightened. I used up my whole allowance of that particular fear before I was 12. A pause. He could hear the mending set down. You have come here to find a crack in my marriage, because if my husband gets a son you lose a fortune you have already spent in your head. I have known it since you bowed over my empty hands in the hall, and I will tell you what you have found, so that you need not go on looking. You have found a wife who is not afraid of her husband, because her husband is the gentlest man she has ever known, and the county are fools, and you know they are fools, and you are trading on their foolishness because it is the only coin you have. That is what you have found. Now you may write to my stepmother, for I am quite sure it is my stepmother, the two of you have the same smell, and tell her the poison did not take in either direction and that you have both wasted your journeys, and that you may as well go home. Corin, in the passage, closed his eyes. He had loved her already. He had thought he had reached the whole of it. He found, standing in the dim passage listening to his wife dismantle a schema with the flat plain truth, that there was more of it than he had known, that love was apparently a country with no border, that a man might keep walking into it forever and never come to the far side. He had spent 4 years believing the best of him had died on a lake. He stood in his own house and learned that it had only been waiting all that time for someone worth spending it on. There was a long silence from the morning room. Then Aldous laughed, a different laugh from his usual, thinner, with the charm scraped off it, and said in a voice Corin had never heard him use, low and unpleasant, "You are cleverer than they said, madam. I will grant you that. But cleverness is a thin thing to stand a whole life on out here, so far from everyone, in a house that will belong to me the day my cousin's luck runs out, and his luck, madam, has run out before." And there was the scrape of a chair, and Corin stepped back into the shadow of the passage as his cousin came out, and Aldous saw him there, and understood at once that he had been overheard, and the two men looked at each other for a long cold moment in the grey light with the truth of everything standing between them, unspoken and complete. "You will leave in the morning," Corin said, very quietly. "You will take your trunks and your creditors and your friendship with my wife's stepmother, and you will go, and you will not come back, and if you send one more word to this house, to either of us, in any voice, I will set my solicitors on the whole tangle of your debts, which I have troubled to learn a great deal about, and I will have you in a debtor's cell inside the month. Do you understand me, cousin? The county thinks I am a monster. You have been counting on it. Do not make me show you what a monster does to protect what is his." Aldous went white, then red. But he was a coward at the bottom, as such men are, and he had heard the truth in it, and he made a stiff mocking bow and said something about ingratitude and blood being thinner than a pauper's petticoats, and went up to pack. And Corin thought it was over. He thought the cousin, exposed and threatened, would slink away in the morning, and that would be the end of it. And he went to his wife and took her in his arms in the morning room and told her he had heard, and that she was magnificent, and that he was ashamed he had ever thought to protect her from anything, when she was plainly better armed than he. He was wrong that it was over. He had made, in his relief, the oldest mistake a man can make with a cornered creature. He had backed it into a corner and turned his back on it. For Aldous did not leave in the morning meaning to slink home defeated. Aldous left having understood one final thing, which Corin, in his happiness, had not troubled to reckon, that if a son of Renner's would cost him Bramhope, then there was one certain way to be sure no such son was ever born, and that a lonely house on the high moor, with a duke the whole county already believed a murderer, was a place where a great many things might happen to a young wife, and be believed of the husband, and never be laid at the door of the cousin who had left, so publicly, so wounded, the day before. It was the grey mare that they meant to use. Corin pieced it together afterward, cold with a horror that would not leave him for years. The girth of the grey mare's saddle, his mother's gentle mare, the one gift his wife loved best, cut most of the way through with a knife on the underside where no eye would find it, so that it would hold at a walk and part at a gallop, out on the high moor. At the far reach of the ride, Renner took most mornings, alone or nearly so, along the edge of the old quarry where the ground fell away 100 feet to the flooded workings below. It was the kind of accident that happens to bold young horsewomen in wild country. It was the kind of accident the county would shake its head over and half suspect the monster of, and never once suspect the smiling cousin who had been 40 miles gone for a fortnight when it happened. It was patient, and it was clever, and it was very nearly perfect, and it very nearly worked. What Aldous had not reckoned, what cruelty, in Corin's experience, never reckoned, because it cannot imagine a thing it does not itself possess, was that the Duke of Bramhope, who had spent 4 years too frozen to notice anything, now noticed everything about his wife, 'cause he loved her. And love is the most watchful thing there is. And that morning, standing in the yard while the groom brought up the grey mare, Corin Ashfield looked at the saddle of the horse his wife was about to mount and felt, for no reason he could have named, some wrongness in how the leather sat. Some ghost of a warning from the vigilant animal part of a man in love, a cold that stopped him where he stood. But that is to run ahead of the summer, and there is more of that summer worth the telling, for it was in those weeks. Between the day Aldous first laughed in the hall and the grey morning of the cut girth, that Corin Ashfield came fully into the man he was to be, and it did not happen all at once, and it did not happen without cost, and a life is not only its crises but the slow hours between them. And those hours are worth an honest telling too. Aldous did not tip his hand at once. That was the danger of him, and Corin knew it, and knowing it he watched his cousin with the cold patient attention he had once given to nothing at all. He had learned in 4 frozen years a great capacity for watching. He had only ever turned it inward upon his own guilt, and found there the same 3 faces forever, the boke, the woman he had not followed. Now he turned it outward, upon the smiling man who ate at his table and rode at his side and admired his wife, and he found that the capacity served him far better pointed at a living threat than at a dead grief. He set Mrs. Peel to watch the servants Aldous had charmed, for the old woman missed nothing and loved her master and her new mistress with a fierceness that surprised even her. He had his groom sleep in the stable, on a pretext of a mare near falling, so that no one came or went from the horses in the dark unseen. He wrote quietly to his own man of business in London, and to a certain discreet fellow that man employed for the gathering of unpleasant facts. And he asked 3 questions. What did Aldous owe, and to whom, and had his cousin been seen, this past winter, in company with a Lady Marrowfield of the southern counties? The answers came slowly, by post, over the weeks, and each one confirmed what Corin had already known in his bones from the moment the 2 schemes had shown, unmistakably, the same design. Aldous owed a fortune he could never pay. His creditors were losing patience. And yes, a coaching in the Midlands, in February, a private parlour, a lady of the description given. The 2 of them had met and dined and talked long and left in different directions. Ruin had found ruin exactly as he had thought, and between them they had made a plan, and the plan had walked into his house with 2 trunks and a laugh. He did not tell Rena all of it. He told her enough, that his cousin was dangerous and had come for a purpose, that she must not ride out alone beyond the near fields, that she must trust knownness of Aldous and carry nothing he handed her, and she took it gravely and obeyed the sense of it without needing the whole, for she had grown up in a house of schemers and did not require a diagram of malice to recognize its smell. But he kept the worst of it back, the debts and the meeting and the cold certainty of murder in the man's smiling patience, 'cause he found he could not bear to lay that weight on her, who had carried weight enough. And here he was wrong a little, and it is worth the owning. For he had sworn to hold nothing back from her, and he was holding this back, and it was love that moved him and not cowardice, but it was still a keeping back, and a marriage cannot be built on the careful management of one partner by the other, however tender the motive. She knew he kept something. She did not press, but she marked it and set it by, and it would have to be reckoned with, and it was later after the girth, when the whole truth came spilling out of him in the stable yard, and she understood at last the full shape of what he had shielded her, and told him, gently and without heat, that she was his wife and not his ward, and that the next time death walked into their house she would rather know its whole face than be protected into ignorance of it. And he had heard her, and agreed, and had made them, if anything, closer, for there is a kind of trust that only survives having been, once, a little breached and repaired. But that was later. In the weeks of the watching, before he knew how near the knife was, Corin found that the strangest thing was how happy he was in the midst of the danger. He would not have believed it possible. He had spent 4 years certain that happiness was a country close to him by his own hand, and now, with a murderer at his table and a scheme he could feel closing around his wife like weather. He woke each morning to a gladness so large it made no sense against the fear, and lay some nights awake beside his sleeping wife trying to reason it out, and could not. Until he understood that this was simply what it was to be alive again, that a living heart does not feel one thing at a time, safely, in turn, but all things at once, terror and joy and tenderness braided together past any untangling, and that he had chosen in the walled garden to be alive, and that this was the price and the wealth of it together. He learned her, in those weeks, past the point of ever unlearning her. He learned that she hummed low and tuneless, when she was content and thought herself unheard, some fragment of a song her true mother must have sung her before she could remember, for she did not know its name and had never learned another. He learned that she could not abide waste, that she saved candle ends and mended what a duchess might have thrown away, not from any need, for she wanted nothing now, but because 19 years of being given the leavings had taught her hands a thrift she could not unlearn and did not wish to, and he loved her for that too, and told the servants quietly to let her keep her small economies and never to remark on them. He learned that she was afraid of thunder, though she would sooner have died than say so, and he learned it by finding her one wild night standing very straight and very white at the window watching the storm come the moor with her hands clenched at her sides, mastering it as she mastered everything alone, and he went and stood beside her and did not say a word about the fear, only put his arm about her and watched the storm with her as though he had come for the spectacle, and felt her lean into him by degrees as the thunder rolled, and understood that he had been given, in the trust of that leaning, something worth more than any word, and she learned him. She learned that the grim silence the county feared was, half of it only shyness grown monstrous from long neglect, that under it was a man who had once talked and laughed and loved too, and had forgotten how, and was learning again, clumsily, like a man walking on a leg long splintered. She learned to wait out his silences and be rewarded, at the end of them, by some sudden offering, a memory, a jest, a tenderness, that had been slowly working its way up through 4 years of ice to the surface. She learned that he read to her beautifully, in a low grave voice, when she asked him, and that he could be got to laugh, a real laugh, rusty and astonished, by exactly the right dry remark delivered at exactly the wrong moment, and that making him laugh was the nearest thing she had to a vocation, and she pursued it without mercy. She learned that he had been, before his grief, a man worth the loving, and that the grief had not destroyed that man, but only buried him, and that she had married the grave and was day by day digging out the living man beneath and finding him, to her own surprise, dearer with every foot of earth she cleared. There was an evening in that summer that Corin kept, ever after, folded away in the warm place of him the way he had once kept only the cold. They had ridden out late, near the house, for he would not let her go far, but out onto the shoulder of the moor where you could see the whole green-gold sweep of the dale falling away west to a sky on fire with the long northern dusk, and they had let the horses stand and had sat saddle-size side by side in the enormous quiet, and neither had spoken for a long while, and the curlews had gone silent and the light had gone from gold to rose to a deep dusty violet over the hills, and Corin had looked at his wife's face turned to that light, and had thought, with a clarity that stopped his breath, I would not undo it, not any of it. Not the lake, not the 4 years, not the debt, not the cruelty of the drawing-room. For if any single thread of that whole dark tapestry had run otherwise, I would not be sitting on this hill in this light beside this woman, and there is nothing, nothing in the whole of the world or out of it, I would trade for this. He had come, without noticing the moment of it, all the way through his grief and out the far side, and found that the far side of grief is not forgetting, and is not even the ceasing to hurt, but is this, the capacity to hold a terrible past and a joyful present in the same 2 hands, and to be grateful at the last, even for the road that scarred him, because it had led here. You are looking at me, Rena said, not turning, the violet light on her cheek. I am, Corin said. Why? Because you are the whole of my good fortune, he said. And I spent 4 years too blind to know good fortune when it stood in a window and looked at me, and I find I cannot make up the lost looking fast enough. Turn your head. There, that is better. She laughed, and turned to him in the last of the light, and reached across the small distance between their two horses and took his hand, and they sat so, hand in hand on the darkening hill, until the first stars came out cold and clear over the moor. And then they rode home together in the dark to the house that was no longer dead, and that was, though they did not yet know it, only weeks from the morning that would test everything they had built and prove it, and that is the story already told. But the hill, and the violet light, and the joined hands in the dusk, those Corin kept apart from all the rest, the still unclouded center of the whole matter, the place he went to in his mind in later years when he wanted to remember, past all the trouble that had come before it and the peace that came after. The exact moment he had known, beyond any further doubting, that the frozen man was dead and the living one had come home for good, for that was the true miracle of it, and the thing the county never understood with its talk of taming and reform. It was not that a plain unwanted girl had softened a hard duke, as though he were a lock and she a clever key. It was that two people who had each, in their separate ways, been taught by the world that they were worth nothing, he by his own guilt, she by every unloving hand that had ever passed her along, had found each other in a cold house at the edge of everything, and had looked at each other clearly, without the world's lies between them, and had each seen in the other exactly the worth that all the rest had missed. She had looked at a dead house and called it grieving. He had looked at the wrong daughter and seen the only one worth having, and out of that double seeing, that stubborn mutual insistence on the truth of each other against everything the world had said, they had made the one thing neither had ever had and both had stopped believing in, which was a home and a welcome and a place at the fire that was theirs and could not be taken and would not be given up, world without end. Corin said. Renna, 1 foot already in the groom's cupped hands, ready to swing up, paused and looked at him. It was not his habit to stop her. She rode as she pleased, and he loved that she did. But there was something in his face that stilled her at once, some echo of the cold, and she took her foot from the groom's hands and stood back. Corin came to the mare's side. He could not have said what had stopped him. Later he would call it love, and mean it exactly, for love had made him watchful and watchfulness had saved her. And he would never again in his life sneer at the notion that caring for a person was a weakness that handed fate a weapon. It was the opposite. It was the only guard against fate there was. He ran his hand under the girth, along the leather, slowly, and stopped. There on the underside, where the flap of the saddle would hide it from any casual eye, the thick strap had been cut. Not through, cut nearly through 3/4 of the way. A clean, deliberate slice, the raw edge of it pale against the dark oiled leather, leaving just enough to hold at a gentle pace and no more. He stood with his fingers on it and felt the world go very still and very cold, and into that stillness came, unbidden, whole and terrible, the memory of a lake in the dark and a boat and a woman he had not followed. Not again. The words went through him like iron. Not again. Not this one. Not while I have hands. Corin, Renna said, low. She had seen his face. What is it? He showed her. He turned the flap of the saddle back and showed her the cut girth, and he watched his brave wife look at it and understand. Understand that she had ridden out on this saddle 3 mornings running, and it had held only by the mercy of a walk, that had she once given the mare head on the open moor, at the quarry edge where she loved to let her run, the strap would have parted and pitched her from a galloping horse onto stone, or over the lip into the flooded workings, and that it would have been called an accident, and half believed a murder, and laid, if it was laid anywhere, at the door of the husband who loved her. He watched her face go white, and then, characteristically not crumple but harden, the guard coming down, the mind beginning to work. Aldous, she said. Aldous. Corin agreed. His voice did not sound like his own. He left yesterday so that he would be far off and blameless when it happened. He cut it before he went. It was to be an accident. A bold young duchess, a spirited horse, wild country, a grieving monster of a husband the county already. He could not finish. His hands, he found, were shaking, and he made no attempt to still them, for he was done pretending to be stone. He meant to kill you, to keep his inheritance, and I nearly let him. I turned my back on him and called it victory, and I nearly. But you did not, Renna said. She took his shaking hands in her steady ones, she comforting him, always she, and he loved her past speech for it. You looked. You did not let me go out into the dark. You followed Corin. Do you hear me? Whatever you did not do 4 years ago, you did today. You looked at the saddle. You said, wait. That is all any of us are ever asked. Not to save everyone from everything, only to look and to say wait when we love someone. And you did. And Corin Ashfield stood in his own stable yard with his wife's hands around his shaking ones and wept, at last openly, without turning away. For the first time in his whole life, letting another soul see the whole of his grief and his terror and his enormous flooding relief. And Rena held him and let him, and did not hush him, and the 4 years of frozen silence broke apart in him and ran out and were gone. But there was no time then for the whole of it, for Aldous was not far. Aldous, they learned within the hour, had not gone home at all, had gone only as far as the coaching inn at the edge of the moor, a dozen miles off, to wait. To be near enough to hear the news when it came and play the grieving cousin, to be the smiling man in black at the funeral of the pauper duchess, and the beginning of his own long-hungered for reign at Bramhope. He had not reckoned on the news not coming. He had not reckoned that by nightfall the story running through the county would not be of a duchess dead on the quarry stones, but of a cut girth found in time, and a duke who had gone straight to the magistrate, old Sir Henry Caldwell, who had known Corin's father and never believed the wild tales, and who examined the sliced leather with grim eyes and asked the one question that hanged the whole scheme, who had been at Bramhope this fortnight, and who had left the day before, and where was he now? They took Aldous at the inn that same night, with his packed trunks and his hired chaise and a letter, half written in his own hand, to a certain lady in the south, begun before the deed in his arrogant certainty, to tell her it was done and to arrange the sharing of what he expected to gain. And that letter, folded into the magistrate's evidence beside the one Corin had carried against his heart for months, was the ruin of them both, for Lady Marrowfield's slander, laid beside Aldous' half-written confession, showed the whole conspiracy plain. The stepmother who had sold her stepdaughter and then tried to profit twice, first by extortion and then by poison, and the cousin she had joined with, who had come to Bramhope to murder for an inheritance. It was not a thing that could be hushed. Corin did not wish it hushed. He had spent 4 years letting the county make a monster of him in silence. He found he had lost entirely his taste for being silent about anything. Aldous was tried at the assizes in the autumn and transported for the term of his natural life, which for a man of his soft habits was as good as a sentence of death, and Corin did not go to see him sail, and did not grieve him, and thought of him afterward as little as he could manage. And Lady Marrowfield, who had not, in the strict letter of the law, held the knife, and could not be reached by the law for what she had schemed but not quite done, was reached, instead, by the thing she cared for more than her own soul, which was her standing. For the whole tale came out, all of it, the debt and the sale and the slander, and the county that Lady Marrowfield had spent her life clawing up into turned its back on her, with the particular completeness that society reserves for those it has decided to be done with. The invitations stopped. The doors closed. Beatrix, whose decline had been a fiction, made no match at all, for no family of any consequence would ally itself with a house so stained, and the two of them lived on at Marrowfield in a shrinking, soaring seclusion, growing meaner and smaller and more bitter with the years. Punished at last not by any judge, but by the exact life they had tried to force on the girl they despised, a life of being unwanted, and overlooked and shut away where no one need think of them. Corin, when he thought of it at all, found there was a rough justice in it that satisfied him more than any gallows would have. He did not let it touch Rena. That was the last gift, and the truest. When the trial was done and the county buzzing, he took his wife away from all of it, north, higher into the hills, to a small stone lodge on a loch that his mother had loved, where there were no neighbours and no whispers and nothing but the water and the light and the two of them, and there, for a fortnight in the turning autumn, they were simply a man and a woman who loved each other, with no ledger between them and no debt and no fear, and Corin thought he had never in his life been so happy, and told her so, and she wept, and told him she had never in her life expected to be happy at all, and that he had given her the thing she had stopped daring to want, which was a home. They came back to Bramhope in the first frost, and the house that had once been in mourning came fully back to life around them, room by room and season by season. The gardens Rena had raised from the dead put on their first true summer of bloom the following year, and the county, which is a fickle creature, and follows a duke as readily as it hounds one, came at last, in its curiosity and its shame, to see the marriage it had prophesied would end in murder, and found instead the plainest and most impregnable thing in the world. Two people who plainly, unfashionably, entirely loved each other. The whispers turned. The monster of Bramhope became, in the space of a year, the reformed duke, the devoted husband, the man whose gentle unassuming duchess had, the story went, tamed him, which was not true, for she had not tamed him, but woken him. And only he and she knew the difference, and were content that the county should have the smaller version and keep its nose out of the rest. In the fullness of time there was a son. Corin held the small, red, furious creature in the great cold hall that was no longer cold, in the light of a fire that was always lit now, and understood that the thing he had married Renna to secure, the heir, the succession, the reason of it all, had become, somewhere in the loving of her, the very last of the reasons he cared about. A thing he was glad of chiefly because it made her glad, and because the boy had her steady eyes. Aldous' inheritance was gone past any recovering now, and Corin found, looking down at his son, that he could not even summon the old cold satisfaction in it, for the man was too far away and too small a thing to darken so bright a day. There would be a daughter after, and another son. And the great house on the high moor that stood 4 centuries in grim silence learned, in the years that followed, the unaccustomed racket of a family, of small feet on the stone stairs his own boyhood feet had run, of a garden full of the shouting of the young, of a long table that was never again laid for 2 lonely figures at its distant poles, but crowded, always warm, always, with the people he had made and the woman he had chosen. He never forgot the drawing room at Marrowfield. He thought of it now and then, in the years of his happiness. The grey afternoon, the 2 girls arranged like merchandise, the stepmother's cracking smile, and the thin unwanted one by the window who had turned her head and looked at him with anger held down and no coyness at all, and said yes to a monster because it was the only door in a burning house. He had gone there to buy a peace, and to take a wife who was furniture, and to go on being nothing safely for the rest of his days. He had very nearly done it. He had very nearly taken the empty, pretty one and lived out his frozen life beside her, and never known what he had passed by, standing in shadow by a window, uninvited, unintroduced, unwanted by everyone in that room but him. The luckiest thing he ever did, he told her once late, by their fire with the house asleep, and the moor wind going round the old tower as it had gone round it for 400 years, was to look at the wrong daughter. I was not the wrong daughter, Renna said, into his shoulder, drowsy and warm and entirely his. I was only the one no one had bothered to want yet. There is a great difference, your grace, and it took me half my life and the whole of yours to teach it to you. Teach it to me again, Corin said. And she did, and he learned it, gladly, every day of the long good years that followed, that no one is furniture, and no house is dead, but only grieving, and that the safest thing a man can do with his heart is not to freeze it, but to give it, wholly, to someone brave enough to have gone on hoping when hope had brought her nothing, and to look, always, and to say wait when he loved her, and to follow this time into whatever dark, and that the girl no one had bothered to want, once wanted, once chosen, once loved out loud and without holding back, is worth more than every polished, pretty thing that was ever set by a fire to be admired, worth, in the end, the whole of a cold house brought back to warmth, and a frozen man brought back to life, and a debt that turned out. Against every expectation of the drawing-room where it was struck, to be the beginning of the only fortune that had ever mattered to either of them at all.